Onyinye was excited, moving from her village to another village to live with her elder sister, Mako, who runs a popular restaurant in a neighboring village. The aroma from Mako's kitchen, especially that of her catfish pepper soup, attracted customers from all over the village. Men flocked to the shop, but it was not just the food that brought them into the shop. The news of Onyinye, a new beautiful girl's arrival in the village, had already circulated, and they all wanted the young and naive girl. Her sister Mako took notice of their praying stares on her and warned her about the dangers of falling for the wrong man, telling her that many came with bad intentions and that she must focus on finding a man who truly cares for her. You should be careful, Onyinye. These men, they don't always have the best intentions. I know you're new here, but don't let them fool you, Mako said. But sister, I am not a little girl anymore. I know how to take care of myself. I'm serious. These men, they are not like the boys from our village. They can be charming, but they don't always mean well. Just as she spoke, a tall, sophisticated-looking, broad-shouldered man stepped inside. His presence commanded immediate attention, and even the other customers seemed too quiet as he entered. Who is that, sister? Onyinye asked. Her curiosity piqued. That's Obinna. He will soon come after you, and when he does, please stay away from him. Despite these warnings, Mako begins to enjoy the attention from the men. I see the way you've been acting. The men who come here, they are not interested in loving you. They are interested in taking what they can and leaving you with nothing. Don't be fooled by their smiles. You keep warning me like I don't know how men are. I am not some naive girl, sister. I am not saying you're naive. I'm saying these men don't care about your future. They don't care about you. I don't want you to get hurt. But what if you're wrong? Onyinye argued. What if I find someone who does care? Why don't you want me to get married? It's like you want to keep me here, working in your restaurant forever. It's not that I don't want you to get married, Onyinye. I want you to marry the right person. I want you to be happy, not trapped in a life you will regret. Onyinye didn't want to admit that. Some part of her believed her sister was just being overprotective, but another part of her felt her sister just didn't want her to leave. Unbeknownst to Mako, Obinna has asked her sister out, and it wasn't long before they began seeing each other in secret. Obinna took her on walks through the village, showing her parts of the town she hadn't yet explored. He bought her a new phone and so many other expensive gifts. One evening, Obinna stopped Onyinye just outside her sister's restaurant after they had gone out together. He took her hands in his. I've been thinking, he said. I don't want to wait anymore. I want you to be my wife. Surprised by the suddenness of the proposal, so soon, Onyinye asked, why wait? I've waited long enough after losing my first wife. I believe it's time for me to be happy again, and I want to be happy with you, he said. Onyinye remembered the warnings her sister had given her. Mako had told her about Obinna's late wife, about how she had died during childbirth. There had been rumors about how Obinna had refused to allow a cesarean section, leading to the tragic death of both his wife and their baby. But Obinna had never mentioned any of this to her. He was always kind and attentive. Was it possible her sister was wrong? I need to think about it, Onyinye finally said, pulling her hands back. Of course, he said, take your time, but remember, I won't wait forever. It didn't take long for Onyinye to make up her mind. Despite the nagging doubts in the back of her mind, she convinced herself that Obinna was the man who could offer her the life of wealth, status, and love she had always dreamed of. And so her sister's warnings seemed to her like the voice of someone who has simply failed to find happiness in her own life because her husband's business was not doing well and she had to foot the bills. Overlooking her sister Makwo's concern, Onyinye got married to Obinna. And Obinna spared no expense to make her feel like a queen. Makwo celebrated her sister on her big day. After all, she is her sister and she had to be there for her. But reality began to sink in. Not long after the wedding, the expensive gifts, the sweet words, and the promises of love all faded. Obinna's temper was unpredictable, and small disagreements would escalate into shouting matches. Onyinye found herself walking on eggshells, afraid to say or do anything that might trigger his explosive temper. Then, just 3 months after the wedding, it happened. They argued over something trivial, something so small, Onyinye could not even remember what it was. But Obinna's rage was terrifying. He grabbed a belt from his closet and beat her until she could barely stand. She lay on the floor. Pains filled her heart for her bruised and broken body. She had never imagined this would be her life. She had thought getting married to Obinna would bring her happiness, which was why she never took her sister's warnings seriously. The pain was unbearable, and eventually it landed her in the hospital bed. She had lost her baby. She had not known she was pregnant until the doctor broke the news of her miscarriage. How had her life spiraled so far out of control in such a short time? How did I end up marrying a man who had no regard for my well-being? I could have listened to my sister. She was right about him after all. Onyinye went on and on, making regretful statements. The thought of her family finding out about the abuse terrified her more than the pain of all that had happened. She couldn't bear the idea of her family knowing that she had made such a terrible mistake. She bore the pain in silence, believing she had no choice but to carry this burden alone, with her mind consumed by regrets and what-ifs. When she was discharged from the hospital, she dreaded going back to the prison she called a house. The thought of it alone suffocated her. But she had no choice at the time. Obinna came and drove her home. He was never sorry for what he had done. Instead, he had blamed her for ruining their family by losing the baby, as if she had chosen to miscarry. She tried to put it out of her mind. Maybe if she played the role of a dutiful wife, things would change. Maybe if she was patient, Obinna would soften. When they got home, Obinna brought out her things from the car and drove off to see a friend of his. On getting inside, Onyinye saw that the house was in a mess. While she had been in the hospital, Obinna had done nothing to keep the house in order. Clothes were strewn across the floor, dishes piled high in the sink, and the air smelled of stale food. How could he be so careless, she questioned. In her weakened state, she couldn't do much, but she tried to tidy up as best as she could. She folded clothes, washed dishes, and swept the floor. She did all this while her body was screaming for rest. That night, when Obinna came home, he found her lying in bed exhausted. The house was still far from clean, and the sight of the mess fueled his anger. "You've been home all day and this is what I came back to?" he asked. "I tried, Obinna," she said quietly. Her body was too weak to argue. "I've been cleaning, but I need to rest." Tired, he scoffed. "You've been lying around in the hospital for days. I expect more from my wife." Onyinye's heart pounded in her chest as he approached her, his eyes dark with rage. She could feel the tension building and could sense that another beating was just moments away. But this time, she wasn't sure if it was the loss of the baby, the exhaustion, or the realization that her life had become a nightmare. But she didn't forward this time. She faced him, refusing to back down. "I've lost our child," she said, "and all you care about is the state of this house." Obinna froze, his hand raised as if to strike her. But he hesitated. Onyinye could see the confusion lying bare in his face, as if he hadn't expected her to speak back. He lowered his hand and turned away without a word, leaving the room. That night, she cried herself to sleep, wondering how much more she could endure. As time continued its relentless march forward, Onyinye began to lose herself, now hollow shell of her former self. Though the bruises on her skin had healed, the emotional scars were still fresh. She no longer recognized herself in the mirror. Her eyes were now dull and lifeless, her skin pale and thin. She had become a shadow, a prisoner in her own life. Obinna's temper worsened with time. Every minor inconvenience seemed to set him off. Though he never hit her again as brutally as that first time, but he constantly abused her verbally. He berated her for everything: her cooking, her appearance, the way she kept the house. Nothing was ever good enough. Onyinye's thoughts often drifted to her sister. She longed to confide in her, to tell her everything she was going through, but shame held her back. How could she face her sister after ignoring her warnings? How could she admit that she had made the worst mistake of her life? Does Marco know how bad he is? Onyinye often wondered as she sat alone in the house. Could that be why she never approved? Did she see what I was too blind to see? But no matter how much she questioned, the reality was inescapable. She had chosen this life. She had fought to be in this marriage, and now she was paying the price. One evening, after yet another argument, she made a decision. She could no longer live like this. She had to find a way out, or she could lose herself completely. But how? Divorce was not an easy option in their culture, and returning to her family with the shame of a failed marriage is not possible. Still, the thought of staying in the marriage was unbearable. As she lay in bed that night, her mind raced with possibilities. There had to be a way to escape this nightmare, even if it meant leaving everything behind. The following morning, while Obinna was at work, she made up her mind she would visit Marco. She couldn't hide her pain any longer. She had to tell her sister the truth. Onyinye dressed quickly, pulling a scarf over her head to hide her face. The last thing she wanted was for anyone in the neighborhood to recognize her as Obinna's wife and report back to him. She slipped out of the house and went to her sister's restaurant. When she arrived, Marco was busy serving customers, but when she saw Onyinye standing by the door, she immediately knew something was wrong. "Onyinye," Marco said, rushing over to her. "What happened? You look terrible." Onyinye's eyes were filled with tears. She couldn't hold back any longer, and so she told her sister everything she had been holding in for months. Marco listened attentively, shock evident in her face. When Onyinye finished, Marco took her hands, her eyes brimming with tears. "I knew this would happen," she said quietly. "I tried to protect you, but you wouldn't listen. Now look at what he's done to you." "I'm sorry," Onyinye sobbed. "I should have listened to you. But I don't know what to do now." Marco held her sister close, stroking her back as they both cried. "You don't have to stay with him. I know you feel like you can't leave, but you don't have to suffer like this." "But what will people say?" Onyinye asked. "How can I face them after everything?" "Forget about what people would say," Marco replied fiercely. "You have to think about yourself now. If you stay with him, you will lose everything, including your life." Onyinye nodded as she thought of her sister's words. For the first time, she began to consider that leaving might be her only option. The day was far gone and she hurried home to avoid being caught. While she pondered on her next move, she had learned to walk on eggshells around Obinna, reading the warning signs in his voice when he was displeased. One evening, Obinna got back from work, unusually quiet all evening, pacing around the house with angry-looking face. She had been careful to avoid confrontation, ensuring everything was in order. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Obinna looked up. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he asked, "Where were you yesterday?" Onyinye's heart tingled. She had gone to the market and returned straight home. "I was at the market, Obinna. You know that. Don't lie to me. I know what you are doing. You think you can fool me, going around flirting with other men while I'm out working. Do you think I don't see the way they look at you?" Tears welled up in Onyinye's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I swear, Obinna, I've done nothing wrong. I've only gone to the market and came straight home. I would never..." Before she could finish her sentence, Obinna lunged at her and slapped her hard. It was so hard that she fell out of her chair. He didn't stop there. He grabbed her by the arm and dragged her across the floor. Onyinye was screaming as she struggled to break free from his grip. "You think I don't know what you are doing behind my back?" Before she could even comprehend what was happening, he had started wiping her with belts, her back, arms, and legs. The pain was unbearable, and all she could do was coil up on the floor, shielding herself as best as she could. The beating was relentless, and she could feel her skin tearing. She cried out for help, for mercy, but Obinna was lost in his rage. Obinna was a monster, and this time she feared he couldn't stop. It was the neighbors who finally heard her screams. They burst through the door, horrified at the sight of her lying motionless on the floor, bloodied and bruised. They rushed to her side and pulled Obinna away from her before he could do any more damage. Onyinye was barely breathing, and so they carried her out of the house and took her to the hospital. When she woke, her body ached terribly. Her face was swollen, her ribs throbbed with pain, and she could barely move her lips. She felt as though she had been hit by a truck. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there. But then the memories flooded back. Obinna's anger, the beating, and the neighbors who had saved her. And then, the most heartbreaking of all, she had lost a baby again. She wept as she lay there. The grief in her heart was unbearable. 2 pregnancies, 2 losses, both at the hands of the man who was supposed to love and protect her. She had nothing left to give, no strength, no hope. She felt utterly broken. Akwa arrived at the hospital not long after she had regained consciousness. The look on her face when she saw her sister's battered body was one of devastation and anger. Her parents had not been informed of the abuse she faced in her marriage, but it was now too much to hide. And so Makwo told them. When they arrived at the hospital, having been notified by Makwo, they were overcome with horror when they saw their daughter on that hospital bed. She was unrecognizable. Their mother collapsed into tears, while their father stood frozen. He could not believe his eyes. "What have we done to deserve this?" their mother cried. "How could we have let this happen to our daughter?" Onyinye could see the guilt in their eyes, but she couldn't comfort them. All she could do was tell them everything about the abuse, the pain, the fear, and the loss of her pregnancies. She confessed it all. "This marriage will end. You will not go back to that monster," her father said angrily. When they returned home, they gathered their kinsmen and discussed what had happened, and then made an unanimous decision to return Obinna's bride price and bring their daughter Onyinye home. There was no room for negotiation. Their daughter would not be sacrificed for the sake of appearances or tradition. Her life was worth more than that. Back in the hospital, Makwo relayed the news to Onyinye. "We are ending this," she said. "No more second chances, you're coming home." But when Obinna was summoned by the family, he came on his knees, begging for mercy. He pleaded with them not to annul the marriage. He admitted his wrongs and promised to be a better husband. "Why did you treat her this way?" Onyinye's father asked. "What has she done to deserve this?" Obinna had no answer. He could not explain his cruelty, for there was no justification. He was simply a man who took pleasure in power and control. "We will give you one chance," her father said finally, though his voice was filled with disgust. "If you truly love her, you will show it through your actions, not your empty promises. But know this, if you lay a hand on her again, the marriage is over. Do you understand?" Obinna nodded quickly. "I swear I will never hurt her again." But Onyinye knew better. Obinna's promises lasted only a few weeks. At first, he was kind and attentive. He bought her gifts, tried to make conversations, and refrained from his usual outbursts. But it didn't last, and slowly his old self resurfaced. It started with small things, an insult here, a cold remark there. Then one evening, when Onyinye accidentally spilled water on the floor, the rage returned. Obinna grabbed her by the arm, digging into her skin with his finger. He didn't hit her this time, but the threat was clear. That night, Onyinye's heart pounded with fear. She knew that Obinna would never change. The next morning, after he had gone to work, she packed her bags and returned to her parents' house. This was the end. There would be no more second chances, no more abuse. She was taking her life back. When her parents saw her with her bags, they didn't need to ask. They welcomed her with open arms. And for the first time in years, she felt safe. She had lost so much. Her pregnancies, her peace of mind, her sense of self. But she hadn't lost everything. She still had her family, her dignity, and the strength to rebuild her life. And that was enough. Obinna's bride price was returned to his family. Obinna pleaded for another chance, not because he was sorry and would try to make a change, but because he couldn't stand the idea that his wife had left him. More than that, his pride was wounded. He had always seen Onyinye as his possession, something he had paid for, and now that she was gone, he felt humiliated. Onyinye, with the support of her family, began to rebuild and reclaim her life. And when the tensions were beginning to grow cold, she traveled to a nearby city and started a small business, selling meat pies, chin-chin, and puff-puff. She also found time to reconnect with old friends, people she had distanced herself from during her marriage to Obinna, because she had been too ashamed to tell them what she had been enduring. But now, with her newfound freedom, she was ready to rebuild those relationships. Her friends welcomed her back and offered her their love and support. Her parents were proud of her. At least she tried to fix a man who does not want to be fixed and had finally decided to focus on herself. Having learned from her mistakes, she no longer ignored well-intentioned warnings. Her life didn't end there. She found another love, and this time her true soulmate.